Okay, so I see that many people are here again. Welcome, everyone. We'll make a start with our discussion today. And as we said, we're going to be looking at the political dimension and the actuality of Buber in the political realm. Yeah, let me just a few household remarks following on from what we were earlier saying. I sent out an email today about these working groups outside of the seminar sessions. So please let Federico know, it's all in that email, if you want to join a group and which group that would be. And then we'll take it from there. The groups can be involved in the seminar sessions that are coming up, but it can also be more a discussion space or a study space or a working space. For example, for people who want to produce some writing for the special issue of European Judaism that we will produce over the course of this year, maybe a little bit into next year, on the actuality of Buber. The actuality of Buber was actually a suggestion by Paul. I was talking about relevance, and we had an email discussion about relevance being such a dirty word. And that is true because it sort of, it stems a little bit from a calculating mindset, right? We have to give everything relevance and pay everything the dues that are coming to them. Actuality is probably a better word because it signals that the attempt or the question, ask yourself the question what a particular set of ideas has to say to our present moment. So we'll stick with that word actuality. So thanks for that. That is what that European Judaism special issue will be about. We'll have. I just wanted to tell you that. So next time we'll have the session on dialogicality, intersubjectivity. I also said psychoanalysis, and we had a little bit of a chat earlier on saying, well, maybe that's a little bit much. We'll see how far we get. I do want to really go into that topic because it's just a question that occupies me so much. Like if you have a dialogue a la Buber, what is the place of the unconscious in there, and of listening to the speech of the other, for example, from the point of view of the unconscious, how does that fit into there? And I'll try to. So Paul also suggested somebody at Tel Aviv University who could maybe shed some light on that. So Henry Abramovich, and we'll see if we can invite him at some point. But for next time, we will focus on Buber Levinas, and we will do that. So Patricia has kindly agreed to present a talk based on her paper about Buber and Levinas, which is already in the folder. So that will be the next session, and then after that we'll have a session on conflict resolution that needs to be planned. After that we will have the feminist dialogues with Buber session that Anastasia will run for us, and then we will have the art and aesthetics that Artemis and Michael have suggested, have offered to sort of organize. So that's what we have in front of us. And today we're going to talk about politics. We're going to talk about the actuality of Buber's philosophy in the political realm. We'll do it as follows. Vic will give an introductory reflection, focusing on the question of the relation between politics and ethics. And I've asked you all to read something, read a couple of texts around the relation between Buber and Landauer, and that might, we thought that would be a good way into that topic. It's historical, but it will highlight the themes of the relation between politics and the moral sphere. And we can then take that into contemporary moment. I've asked Paul to say a little bit about the background of the book on Landauer, Anarchist and Jew, which is also in our pre-reading folder, because as we were preparing it, Vic and I, this session, we read the book and we were really sort of impressed by the richness of it. So it would be nice to hear a little bit about the background to that book. And then we will start the discussion on the actuality of Buber's philosophy in the political realm, and Marcus will kick that off for us. And then we will just have an open discussion. I see a raised hand by Federico.
Yes, no, just an organizational aspect. So yes, it's me taking charge of the coordination of the groups. As Jordan suggested, we can have a brief update of who is in which group, maybe next week before the next seminar session. So we can keep this 7 to 10 days as a recruitment phase, if we want to call it like that, and then we can organize a session, either the first part of the next session or maybe a call for those who join the working groups in which we organize ourselves. So
okay, that's great. No, excellent, thank you. If everybody just lets Federico know, then we'll communicate from there. Excellent. Okay, great. So, Vic, can I hand over to you?
Yeah. So this is going to be just opening up a series of questions or concerns. And it started about thinking about the question about what does it mean to share histories? And how does the sharing of histories mean that we find ourselves inheriting, often unconsciously, a certain understanding of how to understand the relationship between ethics and politics? And how do we think in our own generations about that experience? Part of this was triggered by going to a conference in the Czech Republic about 4 or 5 years ago. It was an ethics conference, and meeting an Australian philosopher who had written and thought in very sensitive moral and ethical terms, a very good kind of moral philosopher, and a writer on virtue ethics. But when we started this talking about politics, there was an amazing break. It was as if the politics had no connection to the ethics. It was almost like a completely different realm. And that made me think, this person was slightly younger than I am, that in his generation, ethics thought about in terms of virtue ethics was a particular kind of disciplinary understanding, but it had very little to do with politics, and politics was about state and the public realm in a very different kind of way. And that made me think about how I, in the generation of the late 60s, early 70s, had accepted a very strong relationship between morality and politics, that they somehow flowed and connected into each other, and that at some sense, being political meant living your life morally in a way that was consonant with your values and your politics. So at some level, we wanted to be the revolution that we wanted to see. And this was a time in the early 70s where we experimented with communal living and with collective forms of politics as part of a kind of interrelationship between morality and politics. A later generation, particularly brought up within a kind of post-structuralist tradition, tended to see morality as the discursive practice which had no particular authority. It was just one discourse amongst many, and tended to inherit within a kind of post-structuralist tradition, but certainly within the structuralist tradition, a sense that what was part of our interior life, the notion of subjectivity, was itself an articulation and internalization of an external dominant discursive practice. So everything that was internal basically comes from the outside. And there was a certain kind of uneasiness or disdain of the notion of the personal, because the personal was somehow seen as part of a humanistic discourse that was seen as potentially essentialist and humanist in a particular kind of way. And this reflected, particularly in Althusser's work, a kind of radical break between the early Marx, who was regarded as a kind of humanistic thinker, and the later Marx, who was regarded as providing a theory of, as Althusser framed it, of history and politics. So there was a radical break and a kind of anti-humanism that shaped many of us gathered here, presumably, given the generations in which we came into our disciplines. And that was at odds with a fundamental kind of feminist insight of the early 70s about the way in which the personal is political and the way in which all the struggles in order to find our own voice. What is it to find your own voice? And is the practice of finding your own voice not a personal necessarily engagement, because the personal is always more than the personal. It always involves engaging with the histories and cultures that we've largely taken for granted. In the early 70s, this was an insight carried by Gramsci in the Prison Notebooks. Gramsci in the Prison Notebooks talks about the way in which our common sense, or what we take to be our common sense, isn't personal or subjective, but carries particular histories, traditions, philosophies that constitute or make up our common sense, but we're largely unaware or unconscious of them. So I was struck in returning to my copy of Buber's Paths in Utopia, which was a text that I'd read with great interest in the early 70s, and that reflected back to my own kind of Hasidic readings as a kind of late teenager. And I followed some of the markings in my own copy of Paths in Utopia and reflected upon my own relationship over time to Marx. And what Buber was doing was recovering a tradition of utopian socialism, and the way in which a tradition of utopian socialism speaks back to Marx, questions in some way, challenges Marx, exactly around this issue around the relationship of morality to politics. That Marx's theory, or a certain orthodox version of Marx's theory, tends to see itself in terms of the contradiction between the means of production and the relations of production. But it tends to be seen as an externalized or an external theory that is critical of utopian traditions of Fourier and Proudhon. And Buber is kind of reclaiming that tradition and speaking out of a very different connection between morality and politics, and in some way challenging the later structuralist and post-structuralist traditions, particularly in their anti-humanism. So the later tradition tend to identify anti-humanism with anti-essentialism. But this is a distinction that Buber refuses, and he refuses it through what he learns from Landauer. And just the pleasure of being able to read Paul's book, the edited collection on Landauer, Jew and Anarchist, or Anarchist and Jew, was itself, even in its title, a kind of provocation that led to a certain kind of thinking. So there was a way that when we talk about sharing histories, there were moments that Landauer and Buber were thinking in the earlier 20th century that seemed to reflect upon or be reflected in some of the politics of the late 60s, early 70s. There was a connection between the personal and the political, but there was also in Landauer's work, and there's an essay that I've been thinking with over the last few days, which is in that collection, which is Landauer's relationship to Spinoza and the significance of that relationship to Spinoza as a critique of a certain strong conception of the human as the rational self. And Landauer's reading of Spinoza allows him to critique that notion of the rational self as somehow mind being in control of nature, and so a dominant Cartesian and Kantian tradition, which seems to see the human in a relationship of control where reason has control over a nature deemed to be animal, and in Kantian terms is framed in terms of emotions, feelings, and desires. This is work familiar in a book that I did years back on Kant, respect, and injustice. It's where I came into some of this work, which was a recognition of a critique of a Kantian tradition and a Kantian moral tradition, and the control that it frames, where reason is identified with morality, and morality is seen as a rational project. And Landauer's reading of Spinoza basically says that in many ways we remain unconscious of ourselves and unconscious of the ways in which our desires and our interests and the movement of our desires and interests are shaping our experience in ways that we don't recognize easily. So Spinoza becomes a way of reconnecting to the body and to emotions and feelings which are embodied, also as sources of a morality. So there is a way of reading the Landau framing of Spinoza, not only as a critique of a certain kind of Kantian ethical tradition, but as a critique of the way in which a liberal moral culture and the common sense that we've all in some way grown up to take for granted has been reflected in a secularized Christian tradition. So that Landau's reclaiming of Spinoza, particularly the reclaiming of the notion of affect and the notion of power and the notion of knowledge in Spinoza, in which our emotions are seen as part of our experience and identity, is something that allows Landau to engage his own kind of Jewish tradition as a counter-tradition to modernity. And what becomes striking in it is the importance of, in some way, the interiority of engaging with yourself. So both in his reading of Shakespeare and in his reading of Spinoza, there's a sense of interiority, or the the important ways in which we're born into a world, we're worldly beings, in ways that often we're unconscious and unaware of, and that often we have to, in order to gain a sense of freedom or autonomy, we have to be prepared to go into the woods, to go into the dark spaces, and to engage our own emotional histories and inheritances and legacies. And that's something that I think Buber learns from Landau, even though Buber's framing often remains somewhat impersonal. The language he uses and the humanism that he draws upon, often you find very less kind of personal framing or expression than you might want to hope for. But in this notion of the interiority, I'm just going to make this last kind of comment, this connection. There's an important connection between Spinoza's work and some of the work in the later Wittgenstein. And Wittgenstein explores this notion of aspects, seeing aspects is how he frames it, but he largely frames it in terms of seeing aspects of objects. So there's a very famous perceptual thing of the duck rabbit. You can see it one way or you can see it in another. But another way in terms of seeing aspects is to engage with particular histories. Aspects of, say, our Jewishness or our blackness or our gayness, or aspects of our being that we have to come to terms with as part of a process of regaining a sense of who we are, a sense of individuality. And it's important that Landau, in his critique of Stirner, talks about individuality, but not as ego, not in terms of the egoistic individual, but in terms of regaining a sense of individuality, not in the way that we're encouraged to do within a liberal moral culture, where we're made, I remember this in schooling, to think that who you are is your own abilities and talents as an individual. Liberalism or liberal moral culture is a schizoid culture, partly because it separates you from your history or your culture and makes you think that that's just your background. But the way that you'll be assessed by your teachers will be regardless of your background. And in that way, your individuality is separated or split. Landau gives, through Spinoza, a way of having to come to terms with those aspects of your history in a way that's not completely different from a kind of psychoanalytic or therapeutic understanding. But the difference is that it's also politically grounded. So the notion that Landau frames is of a sense of spirit or spirituality that is part of a critique of a certain kind of materialism. So there's a way that Landau opens up an exploration of a critique of a certain kind of Marx, a learning that Buber continues from the importance of from the importance of Moses Hess, and a kind of recognition of a different kind of source. So I'm just going to, this is from the introduction, a helpful introduction to the Paths of Utopia, but it's an interesting moment that I just want to end on. And this is both Buber's appreciation of Hess's work, particularly the text Rome and Jerusalem, which is there in in what he says. He says, I'm just quite, and he's talking about Hess, but in some way talking about himself. And he talks about the importance of seeing socialism in a wider cosmic context, not into a materialistically grounded context, but following on from Spinoza. So Spinoza is the source for both Hess, but then Landau and Buber in some way, into harmonious conformity to a law which manifests itself in different spheres, the cosmic, the organic, the practical, and the social, without any possibility of deriving one from the other. So there's a critique of the notion of a kind of scientistic reductionism. These different spheres of life can't be reduced to one or given a causal technical explanation. But we need to kind of recognize these different spheres of life in their relationship with each other and through the tensions which we might kind of recognize. And then there's also a second quote, which is Buber's opening to Rav Kook, who was a kind of early Zionist religious teacher who has so much to teach us, really interesting spiritual writing. And he says of Rav Kook, and for him, holiness means not a sphere above life, but the renewal of life and unity, and the transfiguration of this wholeness and unity. And there's a way that Buber is talking about the notion of community as something that involves the renewal of all of us as individuals in sharing a certain kind of spirit and a certain kind of commitment. In the early years, this was manifest in the institution of the kibbutz in Israel, which was an important example of an alternative. But it shows the framing of a certain kind of socialism in Landau's work that Buber learns from, that talks about dialogue and communication, or an ethics of dialogue, in a way that holds a significant relationship between the ethical and the political in a way that we still need to recover now. End of bit. I hope that was helpful in some way, but I thought it was also helpful in terms of thinking about the different generations that we are gathered in this virtual space and how hard it can be. I started with this, of kind of explaining across generations insights that you've discovered but become quite difficult to think or to translate. Often we talk about translation across generations, but often it's very difficult to do. But there's a way that the collection that Paul edited speaks of a time that can feel very different from our own time, but in some way connected to an earlier generation where the notion that the personal is political and the idea of learning from experience remains alive and important to engage with.
Thanks very much. Thanks very much, Vic, for that. I'm sorry. I'm trying to get the chat to function for everyone, because Anastasia just made a, a comment. And
I didn't know it was disabled for public view, so I sent you a lengthy question, Johan. It could only go straight to you, to the host.
I must be able to change that, right? Oh, God.
I can't get it to go to anybody else. It's disabled, and it only goes to you, to the host. But I'm happy to read it.
Yes, I think that would be great, because I think it's an excellent response to what Vic was how Vic was trying to get us to think about this relation between ethics and politics, and how Buber and Landauer learn from each other in a way. Buber learning from Landauer that there are these different realms that cannot be reduced to one another, but maybe also Landauer learning from Buber. Okay, go ahead, Anastasia, please.
Sorry, I didn't mean to jump in there. That's why I wanted to send it through the chat. But thanks very much, Vic. Really fantastic framing of some key issues when it comes to ethics and politics in the state. So my reflections as you were speaking are the following. Landauer's thought offers a radical displacement of the conceptualization of state sovereignty through autonomous forms of three concepts: affinity, community, and subjectivity. Synthetically, these three notions offer pathways to self-transformation in the psychoanalytical way. So my question is, what parallels can we make to political thought in which the dialogic capacity via Buber of sovereignty is called into question when, for instance, political protest is not always a form of activism and dissent toward community actualization in democratic terms, for example, insurrection events in Washington, D.C. recently, but on the contrary, they become a denial of humanity and community? Are there limitations here to developing a political philosophy via Landauer and Buber in terms of an ethics of dialogue and the state?
That's great, and really relevant in the starting point that Buber learns, and I think he learns this from Landauer, is to do with with how we think the relationship to the state. And the notion, his questioning of Kropotkin's idea that the state is something that can somehow be removed through revolutionary action. And Landauer, and I think this is difficult to think about, but it's a really kind of interesting way of framing it. Buber starts his, just trying to find it now. Buber starts his chapter on Landauer. This is in Past in Utopia, saying, the state is not, as Kropotkin thinks, an institution which can be destroyed by a revolution. And this is Landauer. And it's not easy to understand what it means, but it would be really helpful in this discussion, exactly in response to what you said. The state is a condition, a certain relationship between human beings, a mode of human behavior. We destroy it by contracting other relationships, by behaving differently. So what does it mean, or how do we see ourselves in that way as citizens in relationship to the state? And how can that be changed? Let me just give you two examples, though it was from my own work in some way. I did some work on the funeral in Britain around Diana's death. And it felt like a moment of political transformation. Something was happening which wasn't in control of the state. The state wanted to be able to frame it as subjects of the state coming out onto the streets after Diana died, but the discourse that happened within diverse communities. In London, it was the gay community, the black community in different ways, came out onto the streets, not as subjects of the crown and in that relationship to the state, but as citizens who demanded the right to take public space and to recognize mourning as a project that they wanted public space and feeling that they wanted to at least challenge the relationships to the state. And you could say, in a different kind of example, in a different way, the organizing that happened in Georgia, in the States, around the Senate rolls, and the kind of communities that were invoked, and the diverse communities that organized in different kinds of ways, shaped a different kind of relationship to the state, even though it was within the context of electing senators, and so part of the state. But the forms of organizing that were there in different communities in Georgia and the way that people mobilized around different issues were as communities that understood themselves and their responsibilities in kind of potentially radically different ways. So that would be a kind of way linking it to what's happened in the US in some way. But it can go either way. There are ways in which the march and the attack on, which is important to understand, on Washington was itself a way in which a certain deferential relationship to the state was challenged. So this can happen in very different kinds of ways. But when Landau talks about the importance, a mode of behavior, we destroy it by contracting other relationships, by behaving differently. That can help us think about, contemporary modes of protest and deliberation and the way in which people take to the streets in different ways. There was a demonstration, was there, years back in Israel, which was called the yogurt demonstration or something, where young people took to the streets and occupied overnight. So there are different forms of organizing which are calling upon a different relationship and challenging the state. And I think in terms of politically, there's a way in which there's a kind of ethical challenge, which is there as a part of a generational challenge to a certain vision of politics. And you can see that in different forms of eco-organizing and organizing around the climate emergency. There are different ways in which people are forming alternative spaces and behaving differently and protesting differently. And I think Landau's work becomes really kind of relevant when you connecting to different modes of organizing and how to understand that generationally, and what language is it that we can begin to speak across different generations, particularly to a younger generation of eco-activists.
That's fantastic. Thank you very much, Vic. I'm contemplating on a paper using ecofeminist thought, and I think I'm going to link it to some of the arguments that you just posed. They're really useful.
Because if you think about ecofeminism, it is behaving differently, and it's having a different relationship to the earth and to nature and to the ground almost. And that helps frame a different relationship to ethics and politics. So there's a way that we're living in a time which is post-structuralism. It's not postmodern in terms of a relativism, but there is a kind of a demand for a new kind of vocabulary in order to shape a different form of politics in the present. And I was struck in reading some of the Landau that there's something there in the Landau work that I was kind of taken with, and speaks, I think, in a very relevant way to the present.
Thanks very much. Emily, you wanted to get into that, make a remark.
Yeah, because I was thinking that all these movements, you know, of protest and the ecofeminist movement, etc., and even the manifestations of grief and mourning after Diana's death, I think we are in the domain of metapolitics. So, in other words, we are commenting on the politics on social issues, you know. On political and social issues, but it's not, I mean, are we changing things? I mean, it takes more, I think it takes more of an action to change things, you know, as far as the state is concerned. And reading the texts, you know, I had trouble in two domains. One is the fact that they are pro-anarchy, and I mean, I cannot imagine a reconciliation of the state with anarchy. They are opposites. And the second thing, I mean, I was really amazed at this infatuation, I would say, or celebration or with the Middle Ages, with medieval society. I mean, you know, medieval society was, okay, they had their own scientific and alchemical preoccupations or occupations, but it wasn't science. I mean, it wasn't an their objectivity was not developed, and they were under the domination of the church. I mean, how can how can they see the medieval society? I can understand as far as the guilds are concerned, but for the rest, how can they see it as an ideal society? I had difficulty with that, you know. I mean, maybe you can, change, but I mean, it was very clear that they are pro-medievalists and pro-anarchists. And these, you know, I had difficulty with these two things because, I mean, politics, I think, is an art. And if you do it well, it's like the art. Yeah, it's like the art of diplomacy. It's an art. And it has its finesse and sa raison d'être, you know.
Politics is the continuation of war by other means. Yeah. Mm-hmm. No.
Yeah. But on the other hand, you know, you can say that war is an art. You can take war as an art in itself. You know, I mean, art, quote unquote. You know, with its regulations and its different, rules. You see.
You could. So it isn't that they're. I mean, on two different things. There's a kind of libertarian socialist tradition, which is, I mean, it's interesting the way that anarchism is or isn't understood, but part of the strength of it is to challenge the notion of the state or the way that we're positioned in relationship to the state. And Landau and Buber both want to do that. So they're claiming a different kind of socialist tradition which draws on utopian socialism. That's one, and trying to value that. They're not medievalists in terms of returning to medieval society. All that they're doing is saying, in the way that Benjamin also says, that notions of science or scientific progress forget that we're so tied up with notions of objectivity and scientific progress that we don't realize how certain values, also values claimed that they're trying to reclaim, say, from medieval society, are values that have been defeated, but are still values that can inform and help us in the present. So Benjamin's notion, Walter Benjamin's notion of how we need to be able to critique and challenge notions of historical progress and understand that the history has been written by the victors, and that often there are values that are there in the past that are important values to be reclaimed. So as you see, like the guilds, so it doesn't mean they're reclaiming everything, but there are aspects, say, in guild solidarity or notions of community or the sense of brotherhood or sisterhood as being acts of responsibility towards others. These are histories that Landau, Buber, and in some way Benjamin in some way are saying we need to really radically question notions of historical progress and scientific objectivity, and we have to be open to different ways of knowing and understanding the world, and that's what they're trying to open up as possibilities.
Yeah. I think the most important point that I retained is that they all agree, and I think this is a fact, that we must aim at some sort of spirituality in the community as a cement that binds different communities and different thought systems together. And I think this is the case in some countries. I mean, I lived in Israel for 8 years, and I really, really felt this. There is something in the air there that it is difficult to find in other places of the world where I have lived. So that means that there is a spirituality, spiritual values that hold this varied society together, And I think in this they all agree that we do need this spirituality. But how to find it, you see, that's the difficult thing.
But it's to be discovered somehow, that's part of what they're talking about in terms of interior, the importance of people's working on themselves and discovering their own value in some way. So it's a challenge to a certain form of materialism.
Yes, exactly.
And that they want to be able to talk about the importance of spirituality, but you've got to be very careful about how you're talking about it and in what context and the way that it can be used. So you've got to be very careful about that.
Well, their main paradigm seems to be the Judeo-Christian. I mean, they consider Jesus to be a Jew, and a spiritual being of the Jewish nation. It's the continuation of. Christianity. They consider Christianity. And I see their point as a continuation of the Jewish morality, all of them. So it's the Judeo-Christian.
You're talking about Landau. You're talking about Landau and Buber.
Yes, Landauer and Bloch and Buber to some extent, less, but.
And Emily, are you saying that that's not correct?
No, I'm saying what I think is that this should be further analyzed, because we, instead of seeing Judaism and Christianity as separate. I mean, to see the continuity in the ideas, you see. Which is what they were trying to do,
Yes. Can I just so I think these are very important points, and I think Vic, the point that you made about the spirit and seeing as, so seeing the world as ethical or moral, seeing the world as political, that they are related like the duck and the rabbit. I think that provides, as you said, provides also a way of looking at the Middle Ages and looking at the idea of progress, right? I just wanted to summarize this discussion a little bit and then go to a couple of comments in the chat, and then we can continue from there. So I think this point, so in Paths in Utopia, Buber sums this up in the chapter on Landauer in this paragraph here, where he talks about spirit. Significance of this third item, the spirit, for the new society to be, is something that none of the earlier socialists recognized as profoundly as did Landauer. We must realize what he means by it, always assuming, of course, that we do not understand spiritual reality merely as the product and reflection of the material world, which is the Marxist view, as mere consciousness determined by the social being and exploitable in terms of economic technical relationships. It is rather an entity sui generis that stands in close relation to the social being without ever being explicable at any point in terms of the latter. And I think the link that Vic, that you made to the duck and the rabbit is very, very good, because that is precisely what holds for the relation between the duck and the rabbit. They're very closely related, but you cannot explain one in terms of the other at all. Yeah, and I think that is something that here then, when Buber remarks about Landauer citing the Christian Middle Ages, that he has something like that in mind. You see it also in, if I can just show you one more, in Lewis' essay from the book on Landauer. And that helps us to understand revolution. On page 68, Buber and Landauer shared a radical criticism of the evolutionist philosophy of progress common to both liberals and Second International Marxists. Both of them published books in which this new conception of history is couched in almost identical terms. It is impossible to know who influenced whom. Rejecting the conformist ideology of progressive improvement, Besserung, Buber wrote in his 3 Editions on Judaism, by renewal, I do not in any way mean something gradual. So it's not gradual progress, but a sudden and immense and ungeheures, but by no means a continuation, but a reversal and a metamorphosis. Rather than hope for ordinary progress, Fortschritt, one should desire the impossible. This also sounds like 1968. Buber found a paradigm for such a complete renewal in the Jewish Messianic tradition. So this relation between morality and politics, or the notion of permanent revolution, as Landauer also has it, has to do with these kinds of sudden transformations, and they are spiritual. I think that is what the spirit then means. I just wanted to highlight that as a kind of linking up what Vic said and what Emily said, and then the next one is Marcus. You had a question here. Could you pose it, and then we go to Jordan and Peter.
Yeah. Thanks. My question was that both Landauer and Buber seem to suggest that societal progress cannot come gradually. It can only come through some kind of big bang, revolution or anarchy. However, they seem to give the example of the kibbutz, as something Buber does, as the supreme example of organic social life through a decentralized network of local socialist villages or communities. Now, the kibbutz developed gradually, and I don't think you could have done it in any other way. So isn't there some kind of dichotomy here between the idea of a revolution to change society and gradual change?
I think that just to respond, I don't think that they think of it necessarily as an apocalyptic change. I think that there is a sense, exactly as you're saying, Marcus, of gradual change and transformation. It's just that you can't anticipate necessarily when things are going to accelerate or shift. So it's not that it's one as opposed to the other. It's that sometimes we're surprised. We can't necessarily plan for it. in the way that you might see in terms of kind of planned socialism. I think that's more the agreement that sometimes we can be surprised. Things can happen in unexpected ways at times that are unexpected. They're not anti-gradualist in the sense that they recognize that things will take time to develop and move, but there will also be moments of sudden shifting, sudden changes. So periods like the the late 60s, early 70s, that was such a moment. Nobody could have anticipated it. The death of Diana nobody could have anticipated or planned for it. We had to engage with it when it happened. So it's in that way. So it's not, I think, necessarily wanting to impose a kind of a binary or duality between it. I think they just don't want to think about it as something that can be carefully planned in advance.
Okay, I understand. I just had the feeling in reading that they were looking to the kind of the revolution in Russia as being the kind of event, or even Jesus Christ being the kind of apocalyptic event which really changed the world, as opposed to gradual movement in one direction. But obviously I may not have read it correctly.
I think there's also a way in the Buber essay where he opposes the Russia. He talks about the difference between Russia and I think Jerusalem, and the example being of the kibbutz movement as a movement that develops over time. So it isn't that the Russian model is somehow seen as the generalized model.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, he does say that Trotsky is better off in Russia than teaching at the University of Haifa, right?
Yeah, I like that. That was a brilliant quote.
Yeah. Okay, so thanks very much for that. We'll get back to you, Marcus, in a bit. So Peter, your point about in the chat about dialogue and language, I think maybe we can turn to that, and then we can also look at Peter Meilander's point about the quote about marriage, and Jordan's question about what values are shared. But can we first maybe look at this point around dialogue and skepticism?
Yeah, well, it's just really to say that, of course, this I and Thou work is a work written after Landauer's unsuccessful kind of participation in the Munich Soviet, isn't it, and his death. So if we go backwards, then the actual the interaction between Buber and Landauer is before Buber's formulation of these types of ideas, and I think. If you look at the work of Landauer, there isn't actually a theory of dialogue. There's a theory of reflection, and there's a theory of culture, but there isn't a theory of dialogue. There's a theory of action based on reflection and the influence of culture, but there isn't actually a theory of dialogue. So let's say the question then is that the relationship between Buber and Landauer at this point is not really one based upon the development of a theory of dialogue. It's much more, I would say, is my impression is, it's much more a theory of the formulation of a type of critical or revolutionary subjectivity. But this subjectivity is not an isolated one. The revolutionary character of the subjectivity is the recognition of the community.
Yeah. I suppose the question, or one response is, and I think that's really interesting, one response is how to understand whether the relationship with Landauer prepares Buber to develop more of an understanding of dialogue. That is the way that Buber thinks about dialogue and the I-thou relationship, whether part of that emerges out of the discussion with Landauer. And also I'm just thinking of the importance of in this book, the Teunis, the Gemeinschaft and Gesellschaft, that notion of community, the difference between society and community, at some level, you could see is reflecting the difference between an I and a thou relationship. That community, or the sense of community, is a sense in which we treat each other as thou, while the social or society in the Gesellschaft is more instrumental. So it's our kind of instrumental relationship to others. So you could see that. I'm not pushing this, but you could just see the politics of the Tönnies distinction, which is an influence on both Landauer and Buber, as helping to shape the question of dialogue. And then the question is, how does the issue of dialogue, how do we think that in relationship to different social forms? Is itself a social? What's its relationship? So that could be a way of kind of bringing them together, or at least thinking the relevance of the earlier relationship. And I think, Paul will know this much more. Be interesting to hear about it. That Landau remains a really important figure for Buber in the shaping of his work and his thinking about the relationship of, say, ethics and politics, almost right the way through Buber's life. He remains a kind of both an inspiration and a guide, and someone who he's in some way thinking with.
Yeah, exactly. So I think that is very, very, very true. And in a way, so the question, Peter, the question that you raise, it has to do also with these other two questions, because so Jordan says, so what is then what's the sense of spirituality can then be considered to be shared, collectively shared, which would be on the side of dialogue, and Peter's remark about we need form, we need tradition, has to do with the social, right? It seems to me that these two things are coming together here. So maybe Jordan, can you maybe say what you wanted to raise in that point?
Sure, it's kind of a different point now in light of what people were saying, but I think the newest instance or iteration, I suppose, would actually connect it to what Vic was saying at the beginning about what does it mean to share histories. And I think that in my mind really encapsulates the tension between committing ourselves to certain values and then determining which values are unique unto ourselves, and then which ones are shared, and in what way, shape, or form, through what process, so to speak, are those values determined, ideally in discourse with the other. And I think that's kind of where the realm between private and public spheres and the discussion on ethics and politics may be relevant as well. I'm not sure if I was clear, but I was just raising more questions aloud. So thank you for the opportunity.
Okay, great.
So I think that's really helpful. That opens up a whole kind of set of concerns as to where, of what shared values are within a particular, within shared histories, and where people have different histories. What are the difficulties of sharing those values across time? And I think these are very real issues that we're living with at the moment, as to whether those become individual values that are then shared by others, and the tension between that and a shared history where we find ourselves having lived through certain kinds of moments with certain ways of thinking which have been shaped by living through those histories in ways that we might be, say, unconscious of. So we might have a reference point, say, living through the experience of the period around Diana's death in London. That that becomes a reference point for people who live through it in a particular kind of way that then opens up certain kinds of reflections. But how you share it, I've been struck with this just with my children, really, who are now in their 30s, and the difficulties of making sense of periods of political activism that I was involved in the 70s and 80s in London, how you translate that in a way that makes it comprehensible to a kind of different generation. So I'm interested in that. So you might say, well, we have the same values, but the way that we carry those values might be different. And in the Landau notion, what it means to somehow come to terms with the histories that you carry is part of both an emotional practice, but also a spiritual practice. So I'm very wary of how to talk about spirituality without bullshit, without it becoming abstract and pointless as to, it's too dangerous almost. But it's showing in their work something about that there are certain kinds of shifts that take place that can't simply be understood as material shifts. There is a kind of interesting work that this kind of left psychoanalyst did called Joel Cavell. He wrote a book called Spirit and History, and he was a kind of leftist figure who spent a time in the 80s in Nicaragua, and it was in his time in Nicaragua that he linked to certain kind of, I'm trying to think of the names, it won't come to me really, of the kind of base theologies that were at work in the Nicaraguan revolution at that time, and how they affected the way in which values were actually formulated. So there are ways that it's not simply materialism, that people believe in. Even a sense of community or solidarity could be a spiritual value.
Yes, precisely. I think that's what Landau has in mind. Right.
Yeah, not that it's kind of religious. It's that the Jewish tradition doesn't draw that distinction between the spiritual and the material in the same kind of way. And that's what they're both reaching for. It's a critique of a binary between the earthly and the spiritual, or the earthly life as disdained and the spiritual life as somehow separate. And in that way, you could see both of them as linking to a possible future of a kind of eco-ethics, in that our being embodied beings with bodies in nature calls for a different kind of ethical consciousness, which Buber learns from Hasidism, and Landau, in Paul's account, learns from Buber partly.
So that would be also a way in which we could start to see how to think the relation between dialogue or I-Thou relation and the state, or the Gesellschaft, and the community, or the Gemeinschaft, which a lot of people are asking about now, and that is something that is yet unclear. Hang on, I'm trying to keep track of all the comments here.
Just to put one example in, just one example very quickly. Some people have said that in the lockdown in COVID in London, say, or in Manchester, different parts, people have come to recognize or realize their neighbors in different kinds of ways, and local community and the kindness of strangers, all these kinds of, now they're not in some great spiritual, they're social but the possibilities of different forms of community.
Precisely. So I'm going to park that topic now, of I-Thou, Gesellschaft, Gemeinschaft, and we can come back to that. But I think Federico has a question about the future, where this is going. So I think that might be something that we would want to bring in now. And then I would like to ask Paul to say a little bit about the background to the book, and then we will go into the really looking at our contemporary moment, and we'll start with Marcus. We'll start that discussion. Is that okay? Because otherwise we're going to run out of time. So, Federico, could you raise that point? I think, if I'm correct, that links to what we've been saying now and pushes it to the next topic.
Well, it was referred to the first comment to Anastasia's remark about what the nature, what holds the community together, and the possibility of developing a community that goes possibly also against the human. She phrased it like this, and also with reference to to what Vic said in the opening about us belonging to different generations and different traditions. It popped to my mind this concept of the whatever singularity that Agamben develops in the Kamen community. I think it was published some 25 or 30 years ago. And he tries to think about the community in a non-essentialistic way, and therefore he sees and he deploys this concept of the whatever singularity, basically deprived of any attribute to the essence, in order to think the freer community possible. Now, in my opinion, the risk of thinking community in this way is precisely that of opening the way of whatever direction. So if there's whatever singularity, there is also whatever direction. So there's no orientation. I tend to read these phenomenon as the one that you, Anastasia, pointed out, as precisely one of the risks, one of the points where what these could entail in practical terms. I am also very conscious of the fact that thinking about the individual and the community in an essentialistic way can be also seen as another imposition. So how can we take into consideration both risks, that of imposing a telos, so to say, to the community, defining a closed community by, I don't know, a series of labels, and which is one risk, and the other one, opening the community to whatever it may come in or out, with the risk of endangering not just democracy, but by humanity itself. So, and of course, it is also, if I step a bit back and not just talking about the community, it is the clash between postmodern thought and those who do not recognize themselves in postmodern thought in this sense. But how can we consider those points raised by post-structuralists, so without ignoring that, but bringing in our conception of community? That is, for me, a very relevant and very difficult question to answer.
Who has it?
No, I think that's a really important set of concerns. If you look at the beginning of Paul's introduction to the Landauer, there's something really challenging in it. There's a way that in relation to Jewish identities, Landauer does seem to hold at that moment a certain kind, I don't think the language essentialism is helpful, but he does say something about even if you're conscious or you're unconscious that you're Jewish, that somehow you are. On the other hand, he then goes on to say, well, for some people, that might mean a kind of Zionist project. And for other people, he challenges the notion that it doesn't mean that you're part of that community, but you're not part of the world community, which links to Federico's point. He says, the fact that you're part of one community, say a Jewish community, in that could make you a Zionist, but that doesn't itself mean that you don't also acknowledge yourself as part of a world community. And then he says there are other people who will regard themselves as socialists in a different kind of way, in which they, in exile or in the diaspora or as diasporic identities, they will shape a different kind of sense. So Landau seems to be open to the possibility that it could work in different directions, that you don't have to close down the community in a fixed way, so it's open to the critique of a certain kind of post-structuralism. On the other hand, it's different to a postmodern framing in saying that it isn't just a question of individual choice as to where you want to ally yourself, because you carry a certain kind of history. And in a kind of postmodern framing, you can disavow that history, but it also can catch up with you. It might only catch up years later, but there are tensions between the kind of universalism, which both Buber and Landau hold to, and that relationship to particularism and the complexity of that relationship. And it doesn't mean, in a kind of Christian Pauline Agamben framing, that the universal is achieved through transcending the particular. Mm-hmm. And I think that would be a real difference between the kind of Agamben framing and a kind of Christian Pauline framing, or reclaiming of a Pauline universalism as a way of challenging a postmodern relativism, and a Hebraic tradition which sees the universal as something you reach towards through an appreciation of difference.
Okay, Federico, do you want to respond to that, or?
I mean, we could. You can go over the other comments if we want.
Yeah. So I think this might be a good point to ask Paul a little to tell us a little bit about the background of the book and how it came about, and that would be a way into sort of taking this discussion, because that's sort of what we're reaching now into the current moment.
Yeah. Well, as any project of this sort was fortuitous. The Goethe Institute in Jerusalem, where I live, sponsored a exhibit on Landauer that developed in Germany, particularly focusing on Landauer and the Bavarian Revolution, which he joined very, very reluctantly. For him, politics was a mistaken path. It was referred to as metapolitics. Indeed, he saw his anarchism as an alternative to politics, which I'll return to very briefly. And I was invited by the Goethe Institute to organize a symposium around the exhibit, and was suggested that I combine my efforts with a scholar from Potsdam, just outside of Berlin. She was the director at the time of the Theater Fontana archive, and she was engaged in, her name is, as untitled the book, Hanne von Volkswagen, not Volkswagen, Volkswagen. Hanne was particularly interested in Landauer as a novelist and as a writer, whereas from the Jerusalem perspective, there was another Landauer that we were concerned with. And that brought to my mind that focus when at the exhibit, a gentleman of 90 years old from a kibbutz, who was born and raised in the city from which Landauer was raised. It turns out his parents were very close to Landauer's parents and knew Landauer as a young man. And he himself was inspired by Landauer, which he shared with many of his generation, German Jews, and established a kibbutz which combined, as they understood it, some synthesis of Landauer and Buber. At the time, I was contemplating writing a book on the friendship between Landauer, which I was contemplating calling a history of an improbable friendship. It was improbable in many ways. Buber was a Lilliputian man, a very small man, hardly 5'1", and Landauer reached beyond 6'5". In his generation, that was really quite extraordinary. And he stood out literally because of his height and presence. But there's other distinctions. Landauer is, at the time, was deeply committed to living the life of what, going back to Jordan's notion of embodying Jung's values. in the spirit of the biblical Hosea, and later on Heinrich Heine, he married a prostitute in order to redeem her from her indignity. And Buber, the young man, is what they met when Landau was 30 and Buber was just 21. Buber was an aesthete. Give you an example, he would always match the color of his ties with the color of his socks. Sort of a dandy, and lived quite well because his father was a very wealthy man and his grandparents, and he had a certain unapologetic bourgeois, if you wish, to inclination. Whereas Landau purposely, although he came from a wealthy family himself, lived in the slums of outside of Berlin. And yet somehow they developed a friendship. And the friendship, and this is, I think, crucial to addressing many of the questions that were raised, was when they both joined in a seminar, an ongoing seminar without Zoom, because they had to be present, that took place in Berlin, led by two brothers. The names are not important, but Heinrich and Julius Hart. And they called the community of this discussion the Neue Gemeinschaft. Here we touch on something I think is essential and over in terms of gestation does in my mind lead to IMLR, which was published considerably after Landau's death. Not considerably, but 4 years after Landau's death. The exhibit, by the way, in Berlin, that was brought from Germany to Israel, focused on Landau, who joined the revolution just 5 weeks before its demise. And he joined us with great reluctance as the Minister of Culture and Education. He was inspired by one of his friends at the time, a man named Eric Musam, who was also engaged. And Musam was devoted to the notion of changing the world through kindness, a politics of kindness, or maybe an anti-politics of kindness. And of course, it proved that Landau was moderate, as undoubtedly you know. And 6 weeks into the revolution that he took part of, he was a counter-revolution, and he was captured and run to death by counter-revolutionaries. But going back to the Neue Gemeinschaft, the question raised by the Neue Gemeinschaft was to challenge Tönnies. Friedrich Tönnies was what we now call a sociologist, and he wrote a book that Victor referred to, published in the late 1880s, Gemeinschaft und Gesellschaft. Gesellschaft represented this urban life, where everything changed. Relationships were no longer based on solidarity, instinctive solidarity, but contractual relationships, instrumental relationships, whereas one sought individual self-enhancement, and one had often very indifferent relationships with one's neighbors. And that marked the loss of something, according to attorneys, characteristic of a pre-modern society called Gemeinschaft, community, where there was a sense of, first of all, small communities, sense of solidarity, sense of mutual support, sense of a common goal, if you wish, a sense of an extended family. Of course, we know families often cannot be necessarily grounded in love, but it was this ideal notion that we do have mutual responsibility, even though, of course, at times friction. The Hart brothers sought to say, is it really lost? Can we still somehow regenerate community within the context of modernity? Modernity being focused on urban civilization, different type of economic relations, etc. And that was the question raised in the Neue Gemeinschaft. Both Buber and Landauer contributed ruminations, reflections on that question. Can Gemeinschaft be rescued? Or do we adopt a melancholic, romantic view of Tönnies that is all lost? All lost. Landau was convinced that it was not lost, and he sought to, and that's the nature of his anarchism. It's maybe a poor term, because anarchists often refer to something quite different, but to create what he called Gegengemeinschaft, counter communities, Gemeinschafts planted within the midst of the current reality. Small communities, such as what we call cell research. I don't know exactly the terms, but cell research, transplanting healthy cells in an alien body. And that was precisely what Landau had in mind. And you can see here that it inspired the kibbutz. The kibbutz, in its pristine moments, was to create healthy cells within the body politic of the world and the body politic of the Jewish world, which is in the process of assimilation. Assimilation meant adapting yourselves to bourgeois, the urban culture, which, of course, fractured the nature of Judaism, fractured the notion of the covenant that we all share and are beholden to. And it took Buber a long time to really understand what Landau had in mind. Well, not to understand, but to internalize it. And indeed, it took 15 years or more for Buber to really understand what was at stake, and particularly that was triggered by Landau's brutal, horrible death. The realization that the world cannot be simply healed by kindness. And as I understand it, and just very briefly, I vow is a way of trying to recreate within interpersonal relationships, foremostly, Gemeinschaft type of relationships. In German, you would say gemeinschaftliche Beziehungen. And that, I think, is the seed of IMLR, that we cannot reconstruct Gemeinschaft, even in the kibbutz. He said the kibbutz is an experiment that did not fail, did not necessarily succeed, did not fail, but it had the right intention. It failed for a variety of reasons, perhaps pointing to one of the comments, I think was Peter, that it can be, particularly as Buber experience, it can suffocate individuality. Particularly those kibbutzim that were drawn to some Soviet understanding of community, which he felt to be a distortion of the promise and challenge of Gemeinschaft. So kibbutz was not a success, but it was still an experiment that did not fail yet. I suspect that we would say today it largely has failed, probably because it was absorbed into Israel's own thrust to modern urban capitalists. I hope I don't offend anybody with that term, capitalist, high capitalist society, where we have divisions of social divisions. We have high tech, which has made many people very wealthy. Over 1 million Israelis who are in high tech become millionaires per year, and many remain poor, dirt poor, particularly when the non-educated masses, if you wish. Any event, I would suggest that, as I understood the conference, to focus on is as both a balance between Landau's literary activities, and he also was translated, he was a great translator, particularly of Meister Eckhart into modern German, but all focusing on what was referred to as spirituality. For him, spirituality had to be lived, not just, and it's not expressed by prayer or ritual, but in the very substance of our lives. And for Buber, that meant focusing on our interpersonal lives. As I think I mentioned in the previous comments, that I vow relationships is a way of restoring trust. I'd like to say something briefly before the footnote. It was mentioned something about love and emotions. But Buber has emphasized that love per se is not an emotion. Of course, emotions characterize and accompany love, but ultimately love is responsibility to the other. We have in Hebrew, ancient and biblical Hebrew, two terms for translated as mercy or compassion. One is shared with Semitic languages, such as Arabic, Rahmanut, which comes from the term for a woman's womb. The mother's instinctive, or instinctual, I guess would be the right word, care for her child. But there's another term in Hebrew for compassion. It's called chemla, which is loving concern for the other. Not simply feeling the pain of the other, but reaching out to ease that pain. The prophets are prophets of chemla, not simply rachmanut. And that captures, I think, the essence might be the wrong word, but the axiological thrust of Buber's conception of dialogue, responsibility to the other, with the hope that we will establish bonds of trust, somehow echoing what has been lost with the demise of Gemeinschaft. And that's why I sought to bring forth in the book on the conference I helped design, with course of collaboration with others.
Hello?
Yes?
Yeah. Something happened, right?
You don't hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you now.
You didn't hear me at all?
Yes, I can. I can hear you now.
You didn't hear me at all, what I was saying before?
But it stopped at some point, and then I couldn't get back in, and now it's back on. But did you continue for everybody else?
But the Paul's talk, everyone could hear Paul's talk.
Oh, they could.
But you just got out.
I was just not there.
Yeah.
Okay, good. I'm glad. So I didn't hear the end of your talk then.
Okay.
But that's fine. Okay, good.
Well, I just focused, if you bring you back into the conversation, the central notion of Gemeinschaft, can it be regenerated, how it to be regenerated. And I suggested that the book I and Thou emerges from the gestation of these concerns, how to reestablish Gemeinschaft-like relationship. And what I believe is at the heart of use a theological concept, the charismatic core of I and Thou.
So that means that you would say that this meta-political or perhaps even anti-political dimension in Landauer, it was a very strong one.
Most definitely. Buber was not a politician, and certainly he was thought to have a meta-political perspective on politics, much like, if you wish, the prophets. The prophets were not politicians, but were reminding the politicians that they cannot neglect attention to those who are wounded, being orphans or widowed, and impoverished, indigent. Excuse me. Those often have a very weak political voice, unless we, or more better off, if you wish to put it very simply, speak on their behalf. I know I once, if you just allow me a somewhat comical view, in Yiddish, there's a term we call a kvetch. Kvetch means somebody constantly complains. But the prophet complains on behalf of others, not his own pain, but the pain of others. And that is a meta-political concern. And not just to complain, but to embody ways of possibly healing the agony of those who are disinherited. As society moves ahead with notions of progress and material well-being and the like.
And wouldn't you regard that as political?
Yes.
I'm wondering what this distinction between meta-political, because I can understand when you say Buber wasn't a politician, but is there a way, particularly in Paths and Utopia, where he's taking on Landauer's critique of the state? And there's a lot of discussion in that, which looks like a wider sense of political, even though he's not a politician.
Right.
It's a political text.
Meta political family, at least she's the one who suggested it. And I think it's a helpful term. Meta doesn't mean beyond, but it means regulating the impulses and pulsations, if you wish, of politics. But it's not seeking power, not seeking representation. but simply in the prophetic mode of providing a conscience for, if you wish, for politics. But not just a conscience that is sermonic, that's very easy, but somehow embodying the possibility of a different way of living with one another.
Sure.
And that I would regard as a kind of different kind of politics.
Yes, different type of politics you want, but it's not politics in the sense of, as we all have party politics, if you wish, or power politics.
Party politics.
But
it is a kind of wider vision, which we might think of as both ethical and political in terms of thinking the relationship between the two.
Most definitely.
Yes, and precisely as embodied, right? So you could say that if the I-thou relationship, as we have said, sometimes reading Buber, it remains a little bit abstract, or what is he really talking about, concretely speaking? This political or metapolitical, so let's say the Landauer dimension emphasizes the embodied, concrete relationality of the dialogic situation,
right.
And that's, you could call that a different kind of politics. I was struck by, that was the last before I was cut out, this that you said Landauer speaks of Gegengemeinschaft, sort of a counter community, and that seemed to me to be quite closely linked to the discussion we had earlier with Vic and Federico around post-structuralism, and for example Jean-Luc Nancy's idea of the inoperative community, where Federico asked the question, can that not become, as Agamben says, just whatever kind of community? But if you see so for Nancy, there's also this idea that a community is not defined by a substantive identity, but by a recognition of the lack, by mutual recognition of the lack in each other, in everyone in the community. That seems to me to be maybe, so we can link that to this notion of Gegengemeinschaft, or this anarchist view. And see dialogue as an embodied relationality that would take the place of power politics. So something something like that.
Could I, sorry, before you move on, Johan, could I ask you, Paul, we're talking about Buber not being a political animal, but he was very involved in Brit Shalom. Was that not an attempt to take a role in Israeli politics in some way?
Yeah. Well, Brit Shalom evolved in the late 1920s, when as a Zoom society, as a reflective community, led mostly by professors who were deeply concerned about the direction that Zionism was taking, and particularly with respect to the conflict with the indigenous population, now known as the Palestinians. That eventually evolved into a political party that was established in 1941, together with Buber and others, as a political party to change the political agenda of Zionism, for seeking a sovereign Jewish state at the expense of the Palestinians. But it was not so much to have, first it was before with notions of an elected Jewish community, but a voice within the political debate before the state was established. And a realization that they have to participate within that debate in a more concerted level manner, not just a closed seminar of professors and their graduate students, but really a voice within the political discourse of pre-Zionist, the pre-state of Israel. So that was, in that sense, political. Obviously, sadly, in my view, they failed.
Yes, and so that might then be a nice way to segue into the topic of the real concrete current political situation and what Buber has to say to us in that context. And that's why, Marcus, I asked you, maybe you would like to say a few things about that from the point of view of your experience, and then we can go into talking about that as the final bit for today.
Okay, thank you. First of all, I must thank you for the bringing in Landauer into this discussion, because it was somebody totally new to me. And I enjoyed thoroughly reading his work and the things which you have said. And some of the things were amazing. But if we're discussing the issue of ethics and politics, and then people versus state, I mean, my real interest in Buber, apart from having been involved for many years in knowing about Buber, is how his thoughts and his methodologies could be involved in the real politics of today. How dialogue can become part of the way in which we operate in a political environment rather than social media, which seems to have taken the lead. And it's very interesting to note how the airwaves have gone quiet since Trump was cut off from his Twitter and Facebook feeds. However, if you look at what's happening in the world today in terms of involving citizens, and I think to some extent the underlying issue is how do we involve citizens? The main thrust at the moment has been something called citizens' assemblies or citizens' juries. There was a very big one in the UK on the subject of climate. There was one in Ireland on the subject of changing the law regarding abortion. And some of them, have been very successful, but others have been tended to be used by the politicians as a way of kind of keeping a lid on political distress or political argument by framing the subject of the debate. And really, this is not a dialogue. It becomes a debate where people are invited to participate over a period of time in a discussion. They can involve experts who will give viewpoints. They stand around the table, and it's to some extent at the end, they make some kind of vote in terms of how the situation can be improved. I mean, obviously dialogue takes place between the participants in the debate, but the dialogue is not the underlying objective of the process. And where I became interested in this whole issue of dialogue was something called structured democratic dialogue, which I don't want to start making a sales pitch for that here, but basically it's a way in which one can put a group of people in a room with conflicting backgrounds, objectives, goals, and remove the power influence in that situation, whereby they discuss how to resolve a particular complex socioeconomic problem. And this is another way in which one can adopt. And what was interesting was when I first became involved in this, it was actually something developed in the Council of Rome in the 70s, this concept of what they call democratic design science. And nobody seemed to be talking about Martin Buber. Nobody seemed to see Buber as a kind of philosopher of dialogue. It was mostly scientific, technical solutions to how you make people discuss subjects and have a dialogue, a real dialogue, where actually conditions, situations of trust, mutual trust, and self-trust are involved, and a methodology for doing that, a scientific methodology for doing that. But really the idea that dialogue as a philosophy was the way in which we could overcome some of our serious political problems today really wasn't part of that kind of environment. And so basically that's what I thought I would put in, and we can then continue from there.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks very much for that. And I think if we focus it specifically on the situation in the Middle East, Israel, and in relation to the Palestinians, I think we see immediately the issue, and also that has maybe to do with this sense to which politics does not go away. How do you have a Buber dialogue if you're dealing with power interests and with unresolvable conflicts? Then what does that look like?
One of the things I was told when I originally started thinking about democratic dialogue for peace negotiations, and it has been used, it was suggested to me that where the conflict is one based on historical or religious concepts and feelings, then it's very difficult to get the kind of situations of trust where a dialogue can take place. And where you have one party not seeing the other party as human, I don't know if anybody has been involved in a recent book launch by Amiai Alon, who was the head of the Israeli Navy and also the head of the security services after the murder of Rabin. And one of the conclusions he came to is when he started to realize that Israel was going the wrong way, was when he started to consider the Palestinians as human beings, someone who could have a dialogue, he could have a dialogue with, because as a commander of the Navy and as the head of the security services, he didn't really look upon Palestinians as human beings who he could have a dialogue with.
So so is this a question that other people also think is relevant? What can dialogue do in the face of real power problems? Artemis, you've raised your hand.
Well, very interestingly, I don't know if it's just a coincidence, but again in the 70s in the UK, there was this interesting idea of social democracy as channeled through community music projects. And this was an idea that took the whole world by storm. And it was a practice promoted by institutions all over the world for some years. And it did show incredible results. Unfortunately, it has been rolled back and it has become some sort of Barbican slash Guildhall product to be sold as a degree in music leadership. But there is an idea there. And of course, there has been the Eastern Western Divan orchestra by Said and Barenboim, if I remember correctly.
Yeah.
And it shows that there is the locus of art. We do have this space that is political, but it removes the power from the center of the dialogue. Now, what is interesting, and I will include in my reading of Buber, is that even though he uttered some of these ideas in his own work, he never got to that point where he could become the forefather of this kind of thinking, mainly because he never from what I've read, and I would be gladly pointed to the relevant text, but he never uttered the systematic understanding of art. And more interestingly, he was rather more enthusiastic about art as propaganda. So for me, there is a connection to be made between Buber's philosophy, the 70s movement for community music, and future conflict resolution through the arts. But this is a connection that at least art historians and theorists need to do now and relatively urgently for these problems.
Thanks very much. I think that opens another very, very important perspective. What is the role of art in politics? And as you say, if there's a kind of tendency for a kind of propagandistic view that Buber would have of that would be very interesting to explore in more depth. Also, if art could be a way to, so if you could make politics into an art, if you think concretely speaking about the situation in Israel, would that make a difference, or could that make a difference? Marcus, do you have a view on that, on art as an element of social, what you were describing, the democratic, structured democratic dialogue?
Absolutely. And the kind of situation where we're finding ourselves in the world today, where more and more jobs are being removed from society by technology, by artificial intelligence, or by whatever, then in order for people to become more involved in society and actually have things to do, then art, theater, music all become very much more important as a way of life. Because once you've removed the mechanical jobs, then what is left? And artificial intelligence today is infringing into areas which lawyers, smart contracts, blockchain, all sorts of things are removing the need for lawyers. So in the end of the day, you will have a lot of professions, accountants, lawyers, that really will not be around as they are at the moment. But I think that most definitely all of these elements are very, very important. But surely in the base, and again, something that Buber was very important for him, was very important, was education. Because until we have some kind of education to accept the other, to put oneself in the place of the other, to admit that the other exists, then a lot of this kind of attempt to have dialogue and create trust will really go nowhere. And I think that's the situation we have in Israel. That really the education system does not encourage, and sorry, Paul, you may argue with me on this, it really does not encourage children to think and to question everything around them. Because the tendency is, if you do that, you start to ask very difficult questions to your teachers and parents and to the society.
That's a very important point. Daniel, you wanted to comment on this.
Yes, I want to mention in Israel, it's known as the Parents Circle Family Forum. In Britain, we know it as the Bereaved Families Forum. It's about 600 families that have all lost a first-degree relative in this conflict. Slightly over half the families are Palestinian and just about half are Israeli. And they're all coming together to say they're not seeking revenge, but actually wanting to work in dialogue with each other. And they have very good dialogue groups. Often their narrative, their story, and the very hearing, knowing that the other has heard your story is half the battle. And so I think that's all very Buberesque and very important. And they usually work in pairs, one Arab, one Israeli, going to schools where the government allows them to, and sharing their personal losses and showing that they can be friends and really stressing the humanity of the other rather than demonizing the other. I know it's fighting against a big state system, but I think here's a question of humanity and community that can make a difference, even in a small way.
Yeah, Daniel, this is an amazing group, and the things which they have done are absolutely unbelievable. But I don't know if this is true, but I have heard that they find it very difficult to discuss politics, a future resolution between the Israeli-Palestinian divide. They can basically talk about any topic, about their losses, about what happened in the past, but as soon as they start to kind of have a dialogue on where Israel and Palestine can go from here, it seems to be less conducive to dialogue on that subject. But I don't know to what extent that's true or not.
Well, let me just confess an interest that I'm a trustee of the British Friends of the Bereaved Families Forum. And yes, they're quite clear. They're not there for the political solutions which will come out of the discussions, but rather that they want essentially to start on the level of human to human respect. And they vote different ways and they support different parties. But on the whole, they are all committed to working with the other as a human being, and they believe from that peaceful solutions can arise.
Yeah. Thanks very much. Anastasia, you wanted to comment on this, because I think it does link indeed very clearly to our next session.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that I really like Daniel's insights here, and I find them very useful. If possible, we can make a connection in 2 weeks' time when we discuss Levinas psychoanalytically through suffering and othering, if we can pick up on those particular concepts.
Yeah. Yes, and I think it has everything to do with the future. Also, it's a dialogue, or it's certainly the way Levinas tries to think about the ethical relation to the other is one in terms of the future that is to come. It is about life being open to the future as an essential aspect of the dialogical relationship. And so I think this question about this, the point that Marcus raised is, well, what about when we start to think about the future? That seems to me very, very crucial. And then also links us, so to the next session, but also links us back to the point that we started with, that Vic pointed out, that there is this sort of idea of not so much of progress, but of a transformative experience in the notion that Landauer and Buber developed around the moral relationship, something that changes or something that creates a shift, and it has to do with sharing histories.
Can I just say something about
Yeah.
timing?
Yeah.
About timing, because, and taking up what Daniel says, which I think is really important in the bereaved parents group, that is, it might take time, or it might not be the right time in which to talk about solutions. And it might not be their task, but their task is to kind of listen and tell or share their stories and their pain. And I'm wondering whether that process or that experience, if Daniel kind of wrote it up or even thought about it, whether it changes our sense of what dialogue is, whether there's also a challenge to Buber in that question of dialogue, in the way that the question of sharing one's pain, and whether either that enriches Buber's notion or at least brings different aspects into it. So that's just a question. But the second question is also about what was being said about the surprise that Buber wasn't part of this notion of democratic dialogue, and a recognition or an awareness of how dialogue has become a technical framing. So it's become technicalized. So if you look at, I think it's page 8 or 9 in Utopia, Buber's challenging the way in which things have become technicalized, so that you see the solution, also the solution to dialogue, as if they were kind of technical issues. So there's a way that Buber can question the way in which that notion of democratic dialogue has been able to be developed in a way that's both scientific and technical. And that's something not only to regret, but also to use Buber to challenge, not just to include his voice, but to use his voice as a way of questioning the way that the notion of democratic dialogue itself has become framed in technical terms, and so moved away from Buber's framing. So some of those 2 points don't necessarily sit very easily with each other, but I think they might open up the question of how to think political dialogue or dialogue in these very difficult kind of situations. And a moment, it was in the 1990s or early 2000s, where Israel-Palestinian dialogue in Britain for a while also looked at kind of religious and spiritual traditions as a way of people opening up and talking. So again, there's a time for different kinds of dialogue in order to create trust, to make the political solution. So when it said, they didn't, or they find it very difficult when they deal with future, well, that might be right, but it might not be their task or the right moment in order to raise those questions.
Thanks very much, Vic. That gives us a lot to think about for the next session. Jordan has raised his hand, and that's the last one, and then we will close off for today. Or was that an old hand?
Oh, I'm not stretching, but no, it's a real hand. So thank you, Johan, and Vic. Thanks for saying this idea of timing, and I find it to be so important that you said that for the following reason. I think reflecting on Daniel's example with the parents' family circle, it seems the question that comes to mind is, what is our starting point in these contexts of shared dialogue? Is our starting point what is different between us, i.e. the differing histories and contested climates, or what is shared amongst us? And although it might not be accurate or maybe appropriate or ideal to describe quote unquote suffering as a shared value, in the example that Daniel was sharing with us, it does seem that the starting point for connection with the other is something shared up front. So I think that relates to what you were saying, Vic, about timing. And that's all I feel that I would like to share. So thank you.
Okay, great. Thanks very much. So we can keep that in mind as we prepare for the next session, because with the relation between Buber and Levinas, there's also this crucial question of what is the place of difference and what is the place of sharing or of not sharing in the dialogic relationship. And so we'll do the same thing next time. We'll have a kind of scholarly beginning where we'll listen to Patricia, who I think has left now, but where she will give her paper on Buber and Levinas, and that's in the folder. So have a look there by way of preparation. I'll also send out some more suggestions specifically from the book. I forgot now if we already put it in the folder or not. Dialogue and Difference, which is that collection of essays on Buber and Levinas. If it's not there, then we will make sure that it gets there. And that will be a way to continue. I mean, this was politics. I think that next session will be more on ethics, and so we can continue to explore these themes, both from a scholarly and from a contemporary point of view. So thanks very much, everyone, for attending. And then I'm looking forward very much to seeing you all in 2 weeks' time, hopefully without internet interruptions. And I'll be in touch via email. So thanks very much.
Thanks.
Have a good evening or good night or day wherever you are. Bye-bye.